We have a breaking news story to tell you about. Apparently, a plane has just crashed into the World Trade Center here in New York City. It happened just a few moments ago, apparently. We have very little information available at this point in time. But
there was another one. We just saw another one. We just saw another one apparently go. Another plane just flew into the second tower. This has to be deliberate, folks.
Actually, it was Bob Franken with an eyewitness who said it appeared that Boeing 757, the American Airlines jet, landed short of the Pentagon. Can you give us any better idea of how much of the plane actually impacted the building?
You know, it might have appeared that way, but from my close-up inspection, there's no evidence of a plane having crashed anywhere near the Pentagon. The only site is the actual side of the building that's crashed in, and as I said, the only pieces left that you can see are small enough that you could pick up in your hand. There are no large tail sections, wing sections, a fuselage, nothing like that anywhere around, which would indicate that the entire plane crashed into the side of the Pentagon and then caused the side to collapse. Now, even though if you look at the pictures of the Pentagon, you see that the floors have all collapsed, that didn't happen immediately. It wasn't until almost about 45 minutes later that the structure was weakened.
Susan McElwain didn't witness the crash, but says she did see a smaller second plane moments earlier in the same area.
And it came right over top of me, and I thought it was going to hit the van because I juked because I saw it. And so I stopped, and it pulled down a little bit, and then there's trees right there in front of me, and it went right up over the trees and went over real close to the trees because I just sat there thinking, this is going to crash. I'm going to see this plane crash. And then all of a sudden there was the big explosion.
Authorities have not confirmed the existence of a second plane. McElwain did tell state police what she saw, but has yet to be interviewed by investigators.
It's been 33 hours since the terrible and unprecedented attack on the United States. There is, as we've said, an enormous search and rescue operation, and enormous and intense criminal investigation. And we're just beginning to understand the extent of the catastrophe.
I welcome this kind of examination.
We came.
And for the international order that we have worked for generations to build.
A new world order. New world order.
We saw.
If suddenly there was a threat to this world from some other species, from another planet, outside in the universe.
Always talk to you like they're the law. And then we're going to Washington, D.C. to take back the White House!
He died. He died.
But that's a wicked woman.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
You can keep it. Period. 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 They are the focus of evil in the modern world. It's a catastrophe.
Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome.
This is the Midnight Rider News Podcast. Hello, America and the world. Welcome to the Midnight Rider News Show. I'm St. Patrick, your friendly neighborhood host, traipsing through the trials and travails that have so tempestuously and untruthfully been blasted into your eyes, ears, and minds by the state-sponsored talking heads, court historians, and textbook conglomerates that control information today. Tonight we have episode 018, 9/11 Truth with Christopher Bollyn. Our guest tonight is writer-researcher Christopher Bollyn. He'll join us from Europe next in the midnight hour. But first, a little cleaning of the castle. Our Facebook page is at Midnight Writer News Show. That's Midnight Writer News Show. Please like us there. Our Twitter is MWN_ST Patrick. That's MWN_ST Patrick. We've been making use of our Twitter feed more and more, so please join us there. And our email still remains midnightwriternews@gmail.com. Now, we've just added an article about the post-9/11 escape or deliberate evacuation of the bin Ladens and the Saudi royal family, and that, as always, can be read at midnightwriternews.com. So we'll be right back with Christopher Bollyn. Listen to episode 008 of the Midnight Rider News Show to discover what responsibility the Secret Service holds for the JFK assassination, which agent mysteriously died before that fateful trip to Dallas, what Vince Palomera thinks of the theory that William Greer shot JFK, and how the agency handled both Squeaky Fromm and John Hinckley Jr.
Hi, this is Vince Palomera, author of the Not-So-Secret Service, Agency Tales from FDR to the Kennedy assassination to the Reagan era. If you want to hear more about what really happened behind closed doors at the White House, listen to episode 8 of the Midnight Rider News Show with S.T. Patrick.
Christopher Bollyn was born in Chicago and grew up during the 1960s in suburban Schaumburg, Illinois. Yes, the great state of Illinois. He was raised in an educated middle-class family. He delivered newspapers before school and became an Eagle Scout at age 15. He served as an altar boy in the Episcopalian Church and earned the God and Country Award. After graduating from high school, Christopher traveled extensively in Europe and the Middle East. For several winters, he lived and studied in Oslo, Norway. He studied Middle Eastern history and Semitic languages at the University of Oslo. Christopher returned to the United States in the late 1970s and began studies at the University of California at Davis. He has a degree in history from UC Santa Cruz. His emphasis was on Palestine and Israel. His last year of university was spent in Norway, Greece, and the newly liberated Baltic states, where he researched the psychological effects of the Soviet occupation on the native population. Many of you know Christopher from the time he spent writing for the American Free Press, but Christopher is now the author of the Solving 9/11 series, which includes Solving 9/11, The Deception That Changed the World, and Solving 9/11, the original articles. His newest work is The War on Terror, The Plot to Rule the Middle East. If you would like to read more, he can be found at Bollyn.com, with Bollyn being spelled Bollyn. That's Bollyn.com. Tonight, we welcome him to the show. Thanks for joining us, Christopher. How are you this evening?
Very good, thank you. Nice to be with you.
Thank you very much. It's great having you on the show. Now, September 11, 2001 changed your work, and I'm assuming your life, dramatically. So let's begin looking at September 10th, 2001. Who were you, what were you doing, and what alternative issues interested you most?
Well, I was a working investigative journalist with a weekly paper in Washington, D.C. called American Free Press on September 10th, and I was with my family in Stowe, Vermont. We had taken the weekend off and gone from Washington, D.C. up to Stowe, Vermont, and we were on our way back to Washington, D.C. on September 10th, and that night, it passed into September 11th at midnight. We were still on the road looking for a hotel, and I was driving down around New York City, and as it was, we passed the World Trade Center at about 2 o'clock in the morning, and still didn't have a hotel, and finally found a hotel room at 3 o'clock in the morning, just inside the Maryland border on Highway 95. And my experience was investigating, my specialty was investigating government cover-ups of atrocities, mass murder type atrocities. I had covered the sinking of Estonia in Europe, which was a cover-up with 1,000 people died on the Baltic Sea. And I had also covered the TWA Flight 800 shooting down that occurred in, 1996 off the coast of New York. And then, so when 9/11 happened, you know, it wasn't a surprise for me to see that the U.S. government was covering up the most important aspects of the crime in order to take the country to war.
As you experienced the morning of September 11th, what were your initial thoughts and feelings? What was the first evidence that you found that told you that the mainstream narrative was not correct?
Well, we watched, it happened, you know, at breakfast time, and I saw that the plane had struck the North Tower as I was getting some, you know, donuts and coffee at the hotel. Went back to the hotel room, told my wife to turn on the news, and with the kids back in the restaurant getting some more donuts, when the second plane struck, we watched that. She watched that live when it happened. Then I decided I would be going back to Washington, D.C. because the Pentagon had been hit. And I called the office and said I won't be going back to Chicago on, you know, not to take small roads because I didn't know what was going to happen next. So we were driving through Pennsylvania when Ted Koppel came on the radio at about noon and said that the FBI was looking for 5 Middle Eastern men who had been seen videotaping and celebrating the attack on the World Trade Center. I turned to my wife and I said, they could be Israeli because, of course, the Middle East is Israel is part of the Middle East. And later on, it turned out that, of course, these 5 men who the FBI was looking for were Israeli. That information was not presented in the newspapers, only in the Bergen Record in New Jersey. It was basically omitted from the narrative in the New York papers and the main newspapers. And that indicated to me, on day 2, day 3, that information, very important information about 9/11 was being kept from the American people in order to compel us to support a war agenda. And that the government and the media were in cahoots, presenting the Americans with a false narrative in order to take the country to war. And in this war we are still in. And tonight, President Trump will be speaking to the nation, talking about his plan to take this war forward. I, of course, hope that he will call quits in Afghanistan, but we'll see what happens.
Right. Now, I've heard a story that thousands of Israelis who worked either in the World Trade Center or around were contacted beforehand and told not to go into work that day. Is that a true story?
Yes, it is. There's a little bit of a jump there. The thing is that the Israeli government reported to the Jerusalem Post that 4,000 Israeli families had contacted the foreign ministry in Israel asking about their loved ones who were expected to have been in the area of the Pentagon or the World Trade Center on 9/11. So that was reported in the Israeli press. And then in tandem with that, there is a story that Odigo, an Israeli instant messaging service that covers all platforms, had given out a warning message in Hebrew a few hours before 9/11, 2 or 3 hours before 9/11, in which they warned the readers or the recipients of this message not to go to the World Trade Center on 9/11 because there would be a catastrophe and they didn't want to be anywhere near it. And this information was taken to Israel by the FBI, and they interviewed, the newspaper interviewed in Israel, I think, Alex Diamandis, the vice president of the company, who told the newspaper that the prediction was correct and precise to the minute, meaning that at about 8:45 in the morning, there would be an attack at the World Trade Center. So when you combine these two stories and understand that only 3 people died at the World Trade Center who were Israeli, of the expected several thousand, you can conclude that a lot of people got the message. And, they weren't the only ones that got the warning. There were other people who got the warning. I mean, even people like Al Franken, Senator Al Franken, in his book, he says that he got the warning too.
Now, San Francisco Mayor Willie Brown received some kind of low-key warning not to fly, and Pacifica Radio later attributed that to a call from Condoleezza Rice, yet we don't have any corroborating evidence of that. But he did receive a warning, though he didn't seem very alarmed by it.
Yes, I remember that. I've heard that too. Mm-hmm. There were many people. There were many people who got the warning.
Okay, so let's try to make sense of what happened. First, there's been a lot of recent chatter about advanced weaponry, holograms, and many other theories. So I'd like to ask what you believe. Did planes hit the World Trade Center?
No, I think that 2 planes struck the towers, and these planes were equipped with missile pods that fired a missile that opened up a hole that facilitated the entry of the fuselage into the building. These planes were quite special. They had been prepared for this attack. Apparently, they had been hardened and strengthened in order to fly at that velocity, at that elevation, and probably had, the wingtips had been the edge of the wing had been hardened. And obviously, if they were packing a missile, it's most obvious in the attack on the South Tower. You can see that just before the plane struck the building, milliseconds before it struck the building, it fired a missile that penetrated the building and came out the other side at a very high rate of with a great deal of momentum, and that indicates that it was a plane, a bomb, and a missile all in one.
Now, it's always seemed to me that the state-sponsored conspiracy theory, that of hijackers working in tandem for Allah, was abjectly ridiculous in a sense that the hijackers were ID'd in part because passports were found in rubble that had been turned to dust. But then that brings us to one of the most commonly asked questions from those interested in 9/11 truth. Mm-hmm. If the airlines were not hijacked, what happened to the passengers?
Oh, yeah, that's the big question. Because the two planes, I mean, obviously the plane that struck the South Tower was not Flight 175 because, United Airlines planes don't carry a missile pod on the underneath the fuselage. So the hijacking explanation is the cover story. When we look at the manifest passenger list for these airlines, originally, of course, you remember they did not contain the names of these hijackers, and furthermore, the hijackers had all basically been issued duplicate identities, whether they were driver's licenses in Florida or stolen or missing passports. So what we have is a situation where their identities, the identities of these hijackers have been stolen. We know that according to the British BBC, I think it was, that something like 7 of these people were still alive after 9/11, living in Morocco or Saudi Arabia. So their identities have been stolen. So then the question is, who was using their identities? What was going on here? And we know that, for example, I think it was Flight 77, or perhaps it was Flight 11, there was Daniel Levin was on that plane, an Israeli commando of American ancestry. He was on that plane along with another Israeli commando, and so they were on the passenger list. So it appears that a very elaborate and sophisticated plot was carried out using stolen identities, planted evidence, and then a completely constructed narrative which is not supported by the evidence. As I said, this was all done, this whole deception was done in order to take the country to war.
It seems to me that the stories of the flight schools in Florida, the idea that they wanted to learn how to take off but weren't interested in how to land, it reminds me of the ways in which the CIA prepared Lee Harvey Oswald in the year before Dallas in 1963. Oswald was seen in Mexico and in New Orleans doing and saying some very strange things. Now, it appears that an elaborate backstory was being created for precisely the time when the media and the mainstream historians would need one. We do know that many of these hijackers had backstories that can be cited, and they often are. But do you believe their backstories were being created intentionally in the same way that Oswald's was in 1963?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Well, yeah, I mean, as I said, the hijackers in Florida, where I think about 15 of them lived in South Florida, had been issued duplicate licenses, and this was done quite intentionally. I mean, the paper in Florida reported that one of these guys would go in and get a license on Tuesday, and the next day, on Wednesday, he would call in, or somebody in his name would call in and say, "Oh, I'm so-and-so, I'm Muhammad Atta, and I've moved to a new address. Can you issue me a duplicate license or new license with my new address on it?" And the DMV down in Florida did so. So this was being done. This was done on a series of these fellows. So what you have here is an Israeli method of stealing identities from Arabs or Muslims, and then inserting an Arab-speaking Israeli to play the role of that person to create false history. It's a little bit complicated, but people who want to understand this, I would really recommend reading a book called The Little Drummer Girl by John Le Carre, written in 1982. In this book, better than the movie, this whole method of setting up false identities and false histories is explained, and it's explained by Israeli military intelligence, who assisted John Le Carre in writing the book.
Let's turn to Arlington County, Virginia, right across the Potomac from Washington, D.C. What hit the Pentagon?
Well, it appears that, as in the World Trade Center, missiles entered the building just before the plane struck. I mean, we have evidence of this. We have evidence of photographic evidence of a huge white hole in the South Tower facade exactly before the plane strikes. The nose of the plane is maybe 20 feet away from the facade, and there's a white hot hole into which the fuselage will then penetrate without any resistance. Something like that happened at the Pentagon as well, judging by the ability of the object to pierce through the exterior wall of the Pentagon, which is 1 yard thick, 1 meter thick concrete reinforced masonry. go through three rings of the Pentagon, which have some other exterior walls in them, and then come out on the ring, the C ring of the Pentagon, leaving a large burned out hole. That was not done by an aluminum body aircraft fuselage. That was done by a missile, like a cruise missile or a very hardened, penetrating warhead.
Right, and precisely, Christopher. The news media was on the ground at the Pentagon very shortly after impact. Now, there were no indentions in the complex where the wings would have hit, nor were there any remnants of the tail end of the plane, which would have surely been there in at least some sort of scattered broken pieces that would have been somewhat recognizable to viewers in the media. There was none of that. Now, this is one of the most secure complexes in the world, maybe the most secure in America, yet since 9/11, 16 years later, we still have no live footage of the impact from any camera in the vicinity. It makes no sense, Christopher.
That's right. The FBI went around, confiscated all the evidence, and has concealed and destroyed the evidence, concealed it from the American people for 16 years. Our country is in very dire straits because the people who are supposed to enforce the law are the people who are breaking the law and preventing crimes from being solved. This is a very serious situation. We know that, for example, the FBI has set up scores of terrorist plots, basically tricking or seducing or cornering Muslims or black people or whatever into indictable situations based on terrorist setups set up by the FBI. I mean, the first bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993 was a complete FBI operation.
How was it an FBI operation?
Well, I mean, if you read the New York Times stories at the time, it was very clear. They reported that there was an FBI informant, an Egyptian colonel. I think his name was Salem. Colonel Salem from Egypt, and he was paid $1 million for his testimony, and his testimony was basically to indict and to lead to guilty convictions for the blind sheikh and these other people who had been snookered into indictable positions. And the tapes, are between this Colonel Salem and the FBI agents. They talk about how the bomb was being made by the FBI. And so that the entire operation was like a big sting operation that went through, and it was meant. When you look at it, our FBI unfortunately has been very corrupt for a while, and it was done in order to convince the American people that Muslims or Arabs were trying to blow up the World Trade Center, trying to attack the World Trade Center, and they made movies, and things to that effect. So that the American people, the TV watcher in America, would come away with the impression that Muslims and Arabs are trying to take down the World Trade Center. And so that when 9/11 happened a few years later, without being encouraged, people would naturally come to the conclusion that Arabs and Muslims had done this, which is not the case at all.
Maybe the most storied event of September 11, 2001 was that of Todd Beamer and the passengers of United 93. Now, we've all heard the story. The Hollywood version of United 93 was released in 2006, Christopher, yet we're still searching for real answers to the real version of events over the skies of Pennsylvania. There's been talk of a second plane, there's been talk that United 93 was shot down, there's even been talk that there was, again, no plane at all. We know that the let's roll scenario is pure fantasy. Yet how do we explain a debris field that stretches across 9 miles of land outside of Shanksville?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. I've spoken to the coroner, Wally Miller, I think is his name. He was the county coroner in that county, and he went there to the hole in the ground. The hole in the reclaimed mine was only about 20 to 24 feet wide, about 6 feet deep. And he said, I stopped being a coroner after 20 minutes because there were no bodies there. Of course, there was no plane there. That hole was most likely made by an air-to-ground missile fired from a A-10 Warthog. The A-10 Warthog was seen flying over the area, and it was reported in the British media, actually. A woman, who was driving her van, and the plane went right over her head, over the trees, and then there was an explosion, and she thought that the plane had crashed. But what she experienced was that the plane had fired a missile into the mine to create that hole. Now, the next question is, of course, what happened to the plane, and was the plane shot down? Well, the debris field is all over the place. You know, there were letters found in Indian Lake, and there were parts found down in New Baltimore, and you know, it's a very big debris field, as you said. But what's most interesting about this Shanksville or Lambertsville area, where the crater in the hole in the mine is that I discovered that the real debris field in that area was around about a quarter mile further in the woods. You know, the woods began a few meters after the hole in the ground in the mine, became a thick forest, and in that forest there was the Reverend Hoover had 3 cabins. His son Barry Hoover lived in one, and Mr. Reverend Hoover lived in another one. And they were told to leave their property because something tremendously powerful had happened right there on their plot of land. And Barry Hoover said that there were, you know, fragments of suitcases and people all around. He may be telling the truth, but that was the debris field where the FBI was doing all the excavating and removal of evidence. And as I said, that's about a quarter mile in the woods away from this hole in the ground. The hole in the ground was given to us as, like, in a circus. The spotlight was shining on the hole in the ground. Look here, don't look in the woods.
Wow, yeah, that's sleight of hand, but on a macro scale. So now we have 2 passenger airlines that didn't hit the World Trade Center's Twin Towers. We have 1 plane that didn't hit the Pentagon, and the famous United 93 that didn't crash into a field outside of Shanksville, Pennsylvania. So once again, these planes had to have been flown somewhere. The passengers had to be accounted for in some way. After all, they did board that morning. And it will remain the most asked question to those like yourself who challenge the official narrative that's forced upon the people.
Right.
But in all sincerity, Christopher, isn't it almost an impossible question to answer?
Well, it requires speculation. But there are stories from September 11th that talk about passengers being taken off planes and things like that. There was an incident at the Cleveland airport that was reported in the Cincinnati AP that day that Flight 93 landed at Cleveland Airport, as well as I think Delta 1989. At least 2 planes were reported to have been landed at Cleveland Airport as a result of bomb scares. That's what they said, bomb scares. And the passengers were taken off the plane and taken to the NASA facility, the John Glenn NASA facility, which is at the north end of the airport. And this story was reported only in AP Cincinnati that morning. But if Flight 93, and I mean, if the Flight 93 information was provided to AP by the United Airlines and the mayor of Cleveland, and these people were taken off the plane and being interviewed supposedly by FBI agents inside this NASA facility. So what's going on here? You know, so what may have happened? You know, we'll speculate. If the passengers were not on those planes, they were diverted someplace else, removed, and somehow have never been seen again. And we don't know where they went. We really don't know. It would require a very vigorous investigation with, you know, arresting the key culprits in order to get the truth out. And I hope that day comes.
One would think that if the passengers survived those flights, they surely didn't survive long after. Now, the chances that even one would talk afterward would be a chance that those in positions of power, the organizers of the events of September 11th, well, it's a chance they couldn't and wouldn't take. So we have to assume that they would have all been killed. Is that correct?
Well, you never know. You know, there's all kinds of drugs and things they can do to people, and you know, things can be done to people. Like Colonel Solomon I was telling you about before, who was involved in the Flight 93 setup. He was given $1 million, and he went into the Witness Protection Program, where his identity ceased to exist as Colonel Solomon. And you know, that happens to people. I have, like I said, I had worked on the Estonia catastrophe in 1994 in Scandinavia, in which we know that 12 crew members survived the sinking and disappeared from Swedish hospitals the next day, and were apparently flown to the United States on 2 planes at unregistered passengers. And these people what happened to them? So I mean, people do disappear. And not always were they killed, had they been killed, but they can disappear other ways too.
Now, I've always been interested in the early JFK assassination research and researchers. I'm interested in what they did, who broke what stories, which books were valuable, and all that. Randy Benson just released an incredible documentary called The Searchers that deals with the early JFK researchers. So I'd like to know, and I'd like to ask you about the same regarding 9/11. What was it like doing early research, and do you find that it was more difficult then, or do you find it to be more difficult now?
Oh, big difference. I mean, in the very beginning, people would talk to you before they had been told to shut up. Like, I called Paulo Lima, the author of the Bergen Record story about the 5 Israelis, the day after the story came out, and had extensive talk with him. And other people, you'd contact these people in the very beginning, and people would speak, you'd get better information. But then they were told to stop talking. A good example is the British BBC had a journalist named Stephen Evans who was at Building 2, World Trade Center 2 that morning. And when he was first interviewed back, 9/11 in the evening in London, he was on the news. He talked about the series of explosions that he felt and witnessed at the base of Building 2. And he went on and on about this. Even when they tried to change the subject, he kept talking about the series of explosions and the human cost that must have been, what must have been, destroyed by these bombs, these explosions that he felt. 3 months later or so, they returned to the subject, BBC, and they talked to him, and he had nothing to say about bombs anymore. Because the evidence of explosions was the first thing that was scrubbed from the record. For example, People magazine came out with a 9/11 issue in September, and they had several eyewitnesses who talked about seeing bombs and feeling bombs in the building as they were leaving, and yet that was scrubbed from the narrative completely. Just like the Israelis, who were seen celebrating the attack on the World Trade Center from the New Jersey side of the river. When I realized that these two elements of the story were being omitted, then I realized that we were being given a false narrative. That the whole story we were being given was a pack of lies, and we were being lied to in order to take us to war. And that's why my latest book is The War on Terror, The Plot to Rule the Middle East. And it's the third book in the series of books that I wrote. I wrote the Solving 9/11 books. And because, I see that the American people in the world is so deceived, they have been so effectively deceived, that there's no resistance to the war on terror. And as I said, Donald Trump's probably going to say tonight that we're going to send more troops to Afghanistan. 16 years on, it's the longest and the most expensive war in U.S. history. And it's been completely counterproductive. So why are we there?
Well, I wish I had an answer to that question. I really do. Now, I remember what it was like to question the official story in those days, and, you were called unpatriotic, you weren't respecting those lives that were lost, you weren't allowing them to rest in peace. But isn't trying to find the truth the most respectful thing we can do? There may be no victory to this, but isn't that the closest thing to a win for those who did die on September 11th?
Yeah, of course it is. I mean, it's very sad that anybody would give in to such ridiculous pressure and not look for the truth. I mean, you think about those hundreds of people who jumped from the building because they were being cooked alive in that building. That was an American Holocaust. There were 2,600 people who were being cooked alive in those upper stories of the Twin Towers. We know they were being cooked alive because there was evidence of molten iron pouring off the 81st floor of South Tower, which means that floor was about 1,500 degrees Celsius. So anybody above that floor was being cooked like a bug on a hot griddle, and that's why so many people jumped. Now, those people, those lives, deserve to be honored with the truth, not a pack of lies. And furthermore, the thousands and millions of people who have had their lives destroyed as a result of the fraudulent war on terror. We need the truth in order to extricate ourselves from this predicament that we're in. The United States is not an independent country. The United States is enslaved to a war agenda, which it has been for the last 16 years. And it's taking the food off of our tables. It boggles my mind that Americans don't protest this 9/11 cover-up and the war on terror, more vigorously. We saw that the other day there were 40,000 protesters protesting a small group of free speech advocates in Boston Common. Well, come on, this is Boston. Why aren't the people protesting the 9/11 cover-up? There are hundreds of people from Boston who disappeared that day and haven't been seen since. Well, but Americans they've been propagandized into submission. They can't see what's happening in front of their own eyes because the propaganda has been so effective, and it's really scary because as we see they're cranking up propaganda of hate in America. They're hating the president. They're hating people of different races and even white people. It's insane. And this is all psychological warfare being imposed on the American people 24/7. It's psychological warfare.
It absolutely is. Now I want to move on to The War on Terror, the title of your new book. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Hamas, Hezbollah. Are we supporting them, or are we opposing them, or is it country dependent?
Oh. Yeah, well, you understand that the Israelis created Hamas in order to split the Palestinian body politic and to take away power from PLO, Fatah. So they created this Hamas group, which they then, vilified as being extremist, and that gives them an excuse to then bomb the infrastructure of Gaza into the Stone Age. The people of Gaza are suffering tremendously. They have no electricity, no water. It's just awful. And by having this evil element they call Hamas, it basically gives Israel a green light to bomb the people of Gaza every couple of years, and do so with justifying it to the whole world, saying that Hamas is a terrorist organization. This is exactly what the War on Terror is all about. The War on Terror is an Israeli strategy that was concocted in the 1970s by Israeli military intelligence under Menachem Begin, and it was rolled out in 1979, and it has been the vocation of Benjamin Netanyahu ever since. And the idea is that they use terrorism in order to wage wars of aggression. So, as I said, the terrorist entity gives them a target and a justification for attacking countries like Syria. Like, for example, right now, the United States is involved in Operation Inherent Resolve with 67 allied nations. And they have been bombing Mosul in Iraq and Raqqa in Syria for months and months and months, and destroying the infrastructure, driving the Sunni population out, driving the Arabs out, all under the pretext of fighting ISIS. Yet at the same time, you will see that when ISIS is on the run, when the Syrian army is making advances, then suddenly the United States does something like bomb Syrian targets and give ISIS a break. So ISIS has been, a senior ISIS member told the Guardian newspaper a few years ago, he said, ISIS was created in Camp Bucca. Camp Bucca was the American prison camp in Iraq. He said, Bucca shaped us, Bucca created us. If it weren't for Bucca, there would be no ISIS. What's going on? So it was created. ISIS was created, Al-Qaeda was created by the United States and Israel and Saudi Arabia. I mean, it's like, you have to understand, it's a little bit of history here, but when the Soviet Union, when the Red Army came into Afghanistan, if you know about Charlie Wilson's war, the United States, read the book, it's very good. In the book you read that, the Israelis were providing the weapons. The Americans and the Saudis were paying the money, putting up the money, and the Israelis were taking the weapons from Lebanon and bringing them to Pakistan. And they were training, the Israelis were training this group called Hizb Islami. It's Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's group. And they were the most anti-Western militant group out there. So the question is, why would the United States and Israel be training terrorists who are anti-Western in Pakistan to go and fight in Afghanistan? Why would they be doing that? And this is the group that Osama bin Laden joined. And they were being trained in 83, 84, 85 by Israeli military intelligence under the leadership of Ehud Barak. Ehud Barak was the director of military intelligence in those years. So you see, this group of terrorists that they trained to go and fight in Afghanistan, then in 1994 became Al-Qaeda, and the rest joined Taliban. I suppose that the Pashtuns and the Afghans joined Taliban, and the Arab-speaking guys joined Al-Qaeda. But it was Al-Qaeda we know Al-Qaeda was really just a list of names who had been trained by the CIA in Israel. That's what it stands for. It's a database. And so these are the people that they had trained for this terrorist operations. And this is, Al-Qaeda then became ISIS. And so it's like they create this terrorist entity, which then gives them the excuse to go and attack countries. The United States military is not in Syria under any legal authority whatsoever. The United States is breaking international law by having its military operating in Syria. It's not operating with the approval of the Syrian government, and furthermore, there is no legitimate reason for the United States to be operating in Syria. But they're there, and they are helping the Kurds, attack. What's their excuse for the American people? They say, oh, we're fighting ISIS. You see? So ISIS, or whatever terrorist group you want to call it, gives the excuse to the Americans and other countries to destroy Syrian infrastructure and cities. That's what's going on. It's pure evil.
Yes, it is absolutely evil and maddening, and in a sense that American troops can injure an Al-Qaeda fighter in Afghanistan where American troops oppose him, but if he can make it to Syria, then he can get patched up by American troops, because in Syria he'll fight alongside Americans against Assad. Now, Christopher, some would go farther than I would and say that radical Islamic terrorism doesn't exist at all. I don't believe that. I believe that it does exist, but that America and American policy has a very heavy hand in its creation. No, not in all of it. Sure, the world is experiencing no shortage of religious zealots who use their ideologies to justify violence. But am I wrong or am I right in believing that most of the Islamic terrorism we see today is a result of decades-old black operations that sadly worked?
No, you're pretty right. I mean, as you said, if you create these people as they did in Camp Bucca. I mean, this is a senior official from ISIS who said this. He said that ISIS was created in Camp Bucca, and that means that I'll find it in my book here. But that means that they create this group they use all kinds of methods. The Israelis have been doing this for a long time. They've been doing this in their prisons in Israel for a long time. They, torture people and give them, easy treatment if they will go along with if they'll become informants when they get out. And it's the same sort of thing. In Camp Bucca, they created these radical Islamic people in order to serve their purpose. Here's what this guy, Abu Ahmed, senior official of ISIS, said to The Guardian in 2014. He said, if there was no American prison in Iraq, there would be no ISIS. Bucca was a factory. It made us all. It built our ideology. How did Camp Bucca build his ideology? Well, you see, if you're torturing people and putting feces on them and just doing terrible things to them, and then playing with their psychology, I have to say that the Israelis have been doing this for a long time. If you look at just like Sirhan Sirhan was clearly a Manchurian candidate, a Palestinian from Bethlehem. Well, who created him? And I think he was created by Israeli intelligence to be this shooter. He didn't kill Bobby Kennedy. But in any case, it's the same sort of thing. So this has been going on for a long time. So they create this group, and it was created with all kinds of methods, psychological methods, and what have you. And then when the war started in Syria, for example, or Iraq, and they need ISIS to do something, then they've recruited all of these mercenaries. Tens of thousands of people have gone to fight in Syria and Iraq with these groups like ISIS, simply because they're paid. People from the Philippines, from Chechnya, from the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, even from Western Europe, even the United States and Canada. It's become like they tried to make it like the Spanish Civil War of our time, but it's nothing like that.
Now, it's been said that the targets for American and Western invasion in general, at least in part, depend on the possibilities regarding corporate control of natural resources, like oil, for example. We then get those who have sat on the boards of these corporations, like Halliburton, controlling U.S. defense policy. Now, why?
Well, if you look, wait a minute, hang on. If you look at look at a country like Libya. Libya is a good example. The conflict in Libya was engineered and created And it was the most stable, prosperous country in North Africa. It gave its people a standard of living higher than anybody else in Africa, with the exception perhaps of the white people in South Africa. And Gaddafi had lots and lots of gold. He had a gold dinar. He had created a underground river bringing water from the desert, into the desert from these oases deep underground. He had provided people with a very good standard of living, and he sat on top of some of the best oil in the world, very close to Europe. And then everything went south for Libya, and the United States and its NATO allies pounded the bejesus out of the country. And today it's a fragmented country. This is the game plan. They balkanize the countries like they did in Yugoslavia. They break the countries up into ethnic statelets and states that don't get along with each other, so that you have a chaotic structure with no real state structure at all. But the extraction of oil goes on. The oil is protected by certain entities, and the oil is being taken out by Western companies and taken to Italy and France and Europe. And it's very, very good oil. So, the country no longer exists, but the oil extraction goes on. And that's what's going on in all of these countries, That's like I said, that's the name of the game. The war of aggression in the Middle East, to redraw the map of the Middle East, is, of course, the bottom line is acquiring the strategic minerals and assets of these countries, like the gold of Gaddafi and the Swiss bank accounts of Gaddafi. Where did all that money go? Nobody's talking. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars of gold and liquid assets have been plundered by the victors.
Now, I know that you've been a victim of this yourself, but how did American policy get so entrenched with Israel that to even question Israeli policy is to be called anti-Semitic or even worse? It seems that American researcher is now even allowed to question American policy more than he or she is allowed to question Israeli policy. How did this happen? How does a country, a nation with laws, policies, and parties, how does it become untouchable?
Well, okay, the Israelis have had, for years, they have been working themselves into the good graces of the Pentagon and the government. But the Israelis have an advantage, is that they have lots of Zionist agents who are, hell-bent Zionists, who are American, or British, or French, or German, or what have you. And this is their fifth column. And these people have, so for example, on 9/11, we had what's called the Defense Policy Board, was comprised of Zionist neocons, most notably people like Paul Wolfowitz and Rabbi Dov Zakheim and Douglas Feith. And these characters were the ones who created the policy in the Pentagon that became the War on Terror. We know that General Wesley Clark, he was a four-star general. He was the supreme Allied commander of Europe during the war in the war in Yugoslavia, when they balkanized Yugoslavia. Balkanization, break the country up into pieces and take it over. And he said in 2007, speaking in California, he said, what happened on 9/11 is that we didn't have a strategy. We didn't have bipartisan agreement. We didn't have American understanding of it. And we had instead a policy coup in this country. A policy coup. Some hard-nosed people took over the direction of American policy, and they never bothered to inform the rest of us. And he went on to say, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, if you're an American, you ought to be concerned about the strategy of the United States in this region. What is our aim? What is our purpose? Why are we there? Why are Americans dying in this region? That is the issue. I mean, this is General Wesley Clark. And he's talking about those hard-nosed guys he's talking about. There's two things he says. He says there was a policy coup. 9/11 was a policy coup. And 9/11 was a hit in the gut that got Congress and the political elite in America to go along with this policy coup. But he says something very interesting as well. He says that when he talks about 9/11, he says, we didn't have American understanding of it. What does he mean by that? Well, he's saying Americans didn't know what to make of 9/11, but some non-Americans did. Well, who's he talking about? The French, the Germans, the Icelanders? No, he's talking about the Israelis, without saying it. So the Israelis interpreted 9/11 for us. That was Ehud Barak was on TV and the BBC and Sky News in Britain before the buildings even fell down. Just minutes after the buildings got struck, he was on the BBC World Television telling the world that the world will never be the same from today on. He said, now is the time for the United States to begin an operational, concrete war against terrorism. Well, there you have it. And that's where we've been ever since. And it's been, so the United States policy was hijacked by deception. And what I'm trying to do is undeceive my fellow Americans. Because anybody who's a TV watcher in America, anybody who listens to the radio or the TV in America is deceived. I mean, they're going along with it. If they're watching TV or listening to the radio in America, they are not getting any 9/11 truth. Rather, they're getting constant reinforcement of the official lies. And it's too far gone. We have to stop it. We have to turn it around. But the only way we can turn it around is by undeceiving people. And it's a tough road to hoe, I have to tell you, because their propaganda has been very successful. The deception has been very effective.
There are two events that I'd like to ask you about now. Two related events that I believe add perspective to the backstory of 9/11. I want to ask you about the 1979 Iranian hostage crisis, and I want to ask you about Iran-Contra. What is it that those taught within the mainstream construct of American education don't know and should know about those events?
Well, I don't know what we don't know, but we do know that Iran-Contra was an Israeli-run operation. The head guy who was running it was David Kimke. David Kimke is a British-born Zionist who became one of the big Mossad chiefs. He also happens to be uncle to Greg Palast, the muckraking journalist, for what it's worth. And the thing is that David Kimke was running this operation at the time when George Herbert Walker Bush was in the White House as vice president, and he was running the operation from the basement of the White House in the Reagan time. And at the same time, Bill Clinton was governor of Arkansas, where they were flying in plane loads of cocaine into Mena, Arkansas. So Iran-Contra is a situation where you have, is a crime where you have the Clintons, the Bushes, and the Israeli Mossad all working together in a huge crime. And it was an Israeli operation, it was one of those situations where they were giving weapons to the Iranians. It was furthering their agenda, by, for example, having the Iranians and the Iraqis fighting each other later. But that's about it. The thing is that nothing ties people more closely together than a crime committed together. So I think that the Bushes and the Clintons and the Israelis are tied together at the hip with Iran-Contra.
I really want to jump in here and say that this is not Christopher Bollyn going all Israel on you again. You can find this in mainstream Reagan biographies such as Luke Cannon's Role of a Lifetime, evidence where the mainstream biographers state that Israel was the conduit by which arms were sold to Iran. So please look that up. I think you'll be very surprised. So, on to the research. Where is 9/11 research going, and what are we looking for in the next, say, 10 years? What's the next phase?
Well, I think that what we're hoping for is what will certainly happen. There will be revelations. Revelations of what type we don't know. You never know what's going to fall out of the sky. These are these unknown unknowns, like I think Dick Cheney used to talk about, or Rumsfeld used to talk about. But the thing is that the reason why there have been so few leaks is because it was a foreign operation. It was not an American operation. It was an Israeli operation, 9/11 I'm talking about, and the war on terror. It's interesting that the Israelis are the ones who have been calling for the war on terror since the late 1970s and talk about building a coalition and going to war, but you never see any Israelis in the battlefield because they're running it. They're the ones who are training and running the Peshmerga, the Kurdish fighters up in the north. The Rothschild family owns the oil, a great deal of the oil of northern Iraq, Kirkuk, and the oil is being, been siphoned out of Iraq, and the profits are going into the Rothschild family's pockets. And the United States and Israel are the operational arm that is increasing the size of this Kurdistan. And next month, September 25th, I think, there's going to be a plebiscite, a referendum in Kurdistan, and they're going to vote for independence. They're probably going to vote for independence, which would mean that we would then be seeing the de facto partition of Iraq, which is the game all along. The Israeli agenda for Iraq and Syria and the whole Middle East is to destroy the military forces of these large Arab countries like Iraq and Syria, and then to partition the country into ethnic statelets, enclaves, who are usually at war with each other. And that's what the United States has been doing for the last 16 years. So we are basically doing Israel's war fighting for it. And that's what people have to understand, because if people don't understand what the war on terror really is, they have very little ability to resist it. You have to understand what it is first, who's behind it, before you can resist it.
We have an email for you. Now, you can answer this if you wish. If not, well, I guess I'll edit that out. Mm-hmm. But the emailer writes, I was a fan of yours at the American Free Press. What are your memories and experiences with Michael Collins Piper and Victor Thorne? I heard there was a rift between yourself and Thorne. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So if this is something you would like to answer...
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Sure. No, sure. I never met Victor Thorne. But Victor Thorne was part of this attack team that jumped all over me after I was attacked by undercover police at my home in Chicago, outside Chicago. So he and his wife, his real name is Scott McCufka. He's passed away. But Victor Thorne was part of this attack team along with his wife, Giuliani. Her name was, I think, Lisa Giuliani. And they tried to smear me and they got me removed from the paper. That was part of the operation. And then he took my research and crafted, mediocre books about 9/11 based on my research, which, I find a little, that's not kosher. And before he died, I called him up when Louis Farrakhan mentioned my name and his name in the same paragraph. I called him up and I asked him, Victor, could you tell me anything, any evidence, any research that you've done on 9/11 on your own, that you've actually discovered anything on your own? And I feel sorry for the guy, but he just kept swearing at me. He wouldn't answer the question. He just kept being very foul and swearing at me. And Michael Piper, on the other hand, I worked with him at the American Free Press. He's also passed away. He did good work on the JFK assassination and Israeli involvement with Final Judgment. He's kind of a strange character, but he was also working against me and writing some very slanderous pieces. Some of these pieces on the internet, I think one's called "Take Our World Back," which has a whole web page of slander about me and my wife. That was clearly penned by Michael Piper. So it's like, but you understand that the papers, these alternative media outlets are not always what they appear to be. There is military intelligence at work. There are outside forces. Who's the real owner of the paper is often in question. Without going into detail, things are not always just, all that glitters is not gold. And it's the same thing with alternative media. Everything that sounds good may not necessarily be good.
It does surprise me that there's so much contention in the alternative media. The real animus should be directed at the mainstream media, historical, and cultural establishment. But instead we fight amongst ourselves like we have a great desire to rule this very small part of the historical world. And believe me, it's not just the 9/11 community, Christopher. It's the same in the JFK community, and it's even worse in the UFO community. Why are we doing this?
So that's easy. I mean, you have to understand that we live in an environment where military intelligence, CIA, and foreign intelligence operatives, they operate in our society like a warm knife through butter, and we are very naive. So for example, here you have the 9/11 Truth Movement. So you have some guy named Christopher Bollyn coming out with all kinds of discoveries and revelations and exposing things that aren't supposed to be exposed. For example, I was working with Professor Stephen Jones with this discovery of thermite. I was helping him a little bit in 2005. The discovery of nanothermite, super thermite, in the dust of the World Trade Center was not supposed to happen. When it did happen, he and I became marked targets, and we had to be taken down. So we basically were taken down within the same month in 2006. But the thing is that the agencies who want to confuse the public will then attack Professor Jones and Christopher Bollyn and honest people like us. They will attack us and in order to confuse the public. So they're the ones 9 times out of 10. The dissent or the controversy, if you will, or the bickering is being produced by an agent I call them agents, they're agents, who have infiltrated into the movement in order to, as I said, confuse the public. That's the main thing they want to do, is confuse the public so that they become tired of the whole thing and give up. So they know that people don't like bickering. They know people don't like arguing. So they'll introduce a subject like flat Earth or Judy Wood's direct energy weapon or this Russian guy saying that nuclear bombs were going off in the building. They introduce these red herrings. They're like red herrings that they then encourage, that they then support, knowing that this will then create divisions within the 9/11 Truth movement. And then what they also do is that, like, they have 9/11 Truth groups that are run by agents, so that the gatekeeper, the agent, is controlling the group. Who he controls. For example, this is the main reason why I'm not invited to many 9/11 Truth events, because what I say, they don't want to be heard. So, they'll talk about all kinds of things. They'll talk about details about what happened on 9/11. Hey, I mean, we have to talk about who did it and why they did it, and how to get out of the problem that we're now in as a result. You see, the policy coup that started on 9/11 is still in effect. 3 presidents later, Bush, Obama, Trump. We still have the same deep state operation going on. Republican, Democrat, Republican, it doesn't matter. It goes on, it goes on. And as long, so that means that the people who carried out 9/11 are controlling our government and our media. That's the situation. That's a very serious situation.
And all to make sure that we stay in a permanent state of war.
Looks like it. It certainly looks like it. And they're pushing not only war in Iraq and Syria. They're pushing for war with North Korea. They're pushing for war with Iran. They're pushing all this hostility for Russia. All of this is manufactured. So that's why the poor American TV watcher is completely befuddled and confused and driven to a point of insanity by what he hears on Fox News and CNN and NBC, what have you. Because they're scaring people all the time. And they're promoting a war agenda all the time. And the only way to get out of this is to expose who's doing it. That's what I'm doing. That's why I'm going on a tour in September and October in the United States again. And this, I do little presentations here and there, California and the West Coast and Boston, what have you, and Washington D.C. And then the hope is that good videos come out of it, and those videos reach a much larger audience.
Well, if you happen to be around the St. Louis or Chicago area, I'll make sure to make the drive. I don't know if you will be, but I'll sure come and see if you are.
Well, I have a little issue in Illinois because I was attacked by undercover police there at my house, and the operation was run by a guy who was working for Homeland Security. So that's why I'm speaking to you from Europe, because the situation in Illinois isn't very good, besides the state going bankrupt.
I was about to say I'm not surprised by that at all, because, our home state is not what it once used to be, Christopher.
Why do you think they put Governor Blagojevich in jail for 18 years? He knows too much. He knows too much, of course. And who's running the state is that Rahm Emanuel, the Israeli mayor of Chicago. He's the guy that created, Clinton. He ran the Clinton operations. He also ran Obama. So he was the Mossad man in the White House. Now he's running Chicago.
It really is sad what's happened to Illinois the last 25 or 30 years, Christopher.
Yes, I couldn't agree more.
And the sad thing is that this is a good area of the country. The people in Illinois and Missouri and Iowa, Wisconsin, Indiana, Kentucky, they're all really good, really nice, well-meaning people, which makes it all the more sad. But our politicians have taken us into the ground.
Well, it's corruption. If you read the history of Chicago, read a book like Captive City, or any political history of Chicago, and it's just a litany of crime after crime after crime after crime. And it's unfortunate that Chicago has always been a very corrupt place, and it's a place where corruption has grown and increased and solidified. So people in Chicago just consider corruption to be, like the wallpaper on the wall. It's like, it's there. What can you do about it? And they don't. It doesn't bother them, and it always bothered me. And it bothered me to the point where I ran for mayor in my hometown, Hoffman Estates, Illinois. I ran on an anti-corruption platform because the people that took over my little village were corrupt politicians from Chicago. They all came out there from Chicago. They all brought their corrupt games. You know, Sears Roebuck took over they built their new campus out there and everything like that. And Henry Crown family, what have you. And it's like corruption rules. And, they chased me out of town.
Believe me, they've chased a lot of people out of town and out of the state permanently. So if anyone wants to read your work or find out about your books or see where you're going to be on tour, how would they go about doing so?
Well, the best way is to go to Bollyn.com, and my books are available on Amazon.com. That's the easy way to get them, or through me. And the book is called Solving 9/11, The Deception That Changed the World. And its companion book, the larger book, is Solving 9/11, The Original Articles, which contains my 12 years of articles about 9/11 up until the year 2012. And then the latest book is called The War on Terror, The Plot to Rule the Middle East. And that's a very small book. It's only like 160 pages, reads like a breeze, because it's very important that Americans understand the fraud that the War on Terror is. You know, if they don't understand it, we have no way to get out. So my website is Bollyn.com, and the easiest way to get my attention is to send a donation by PayPal to Bollyn at BollynBooks.com, and a donation of $20 from a person in the United States, I'll send you a copy of the latest book. Yeah, shipping and handling included. So and that money is be very helpful in my tour, which starts in about 10 days.
Well, we absolutely hope that people will donate, and we hope the tour is a successful one.
Thank you.
So where's the tour going to be, actually?
Well, thank you very much. I'll be on tour for about, 2 months, 6 weeks, 2 months, all of September and October. And September 11th, I'll be at the National Press Club with Richard Gage.
He's Christopher Bollyn at Bollyn.com. Hey, thanks for being on with us tonight, Christopher.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
I'm St. Patrick. This is the Midnight Rider News Show, and we'll be right back. Who were the first researchers out of the box to question the Warren Commission's version of the JFK assassination? What obstacles did they have to face? How did their research bind them and inspire their work to this day? And just what did Randy Benson buy at the Last Hurrah bookstore? You won't believe it.
This is Randy Benson, director, producer, and writer of the documentary film The Searchers. To hear more about The Searchers, listen to episode 9 of the Midnight Rider News Show.
I want to thank Christopher Bollyn for appearing tonight. To say that he is controversial amongst mainstream circles is an understatement. But you heard him tonight. What do you think? Is he controversial, or is he just a danger to the establishment out to push the mainstream narrative onto our televisions, our schools, and our minds? I'll let you decide. To say that it is hard to challenge the establishment on 9/11 issues is also an understatement. 16 years have passed, but it's still fresh in our minds and our memories. We not only have memories of that day within us, instantly recallable, we have the images of the towers collapsing into pools of molten steel as dust blankets the people on the streets of Manhattan. We have a giant gaping hole in the Pentagon, the symbol of our national security in a dangerous world. And we have what is maybe the most difficult to understand, a field in Pennsylvania. Yes, just a field. These are the things we see in our minds when we think of 9/11. But the media has done an incredible job of emotionalizing those memories even more than they had been initially. The documentaries have sweet, soft music meant to evoke sadness and tears. The images of the unsmiling radical Muslims blanketed our screens for years thereafter. And even that field in Pennsylvania was given the dramatic Hollywood treatment as the media latched onto what is almost assuredly a fictional let's roll story. 9/11 has been turned into a United 93 movie. $12 a head, please. $30 for Coke and popcorn. And the memories have turned into made-for-TV anniversaries. Meanwhile, thousands of men and women of all ages, races, and nationalities die on the battlefields of the Middle East, or as many there call them, hometowns. This is the permanent war state that we have, and this is the war state that many Americans wanted. The call to war after the bombing of the shooting of the Archduke, Pearl Harbor, the Gulf of Tonkin, yes, 9/11. The call to war was not just a call, but a demand. Please protect us. as Chicago, New Orleans, and Detroit turn into sectionalized war zones for impoverished Americans structurally damaged domestically by the international war state, billions of dollars are spent to make sure that a radicalized follower of Islam in the economically depressed country of Afghanistan can't hijack an airliner in 10 years. So, do you feel safe? From the other side of the mountain, on the best side of midnight, I wish you peace.
The Midnight Rider News Show with St. Patrick is a production of MidnightRiderNews.com. Copyright belongs to St. Patrick and all rights reserved. You can email us at midnightridernews@gmail.com and be sure to visit midnightridernews.com for the best in alternative historical analysis. This is Leanne saying thank you for listening, have a great night, and always remember, when life throws you lemons, throw them back into man chocolate.